All right, looks like we're on the air. Yay! Hi, everybody. Welcome to the AAPIVoices Google Hangout. So you want to be a data mapper. I'm Cayden. I'm the new media director at 18 Million Rising, which is one of the partners that started AAPIVoices. And I'm joined today by a panel of experts who do work across, I guess, different intersections of data and population. Looks like we're on the air. So, man, I'm feeding back. Hold on. Hi, everybody. Welcome to feeding back. Google Hangout. Weird. So you want to be a data mapper. I'm Cayden. I'm the new media director at 18 Million Rising, which is one of the partners that started. I'm trying to figure out why I'm feeding back here. Sorry, guys. Today by panel of experts. Ha! Shazam! Found it. I had this open in a window on my other machine. All right. So I'm joined today by a panel of experts who are working with data in a variety of different ways, including journalism, voting rights. We have with us, you can't see him on the Hangout, but he is with us, Eric Vikstrom from the U.S. Census Bureau. And really quickly, 18 Million Rising is an organization that does online activism around the Asian American community. And we started AAPIVoices with Karthick Ramakrishnan, who is joining us today, in order to lift up the voices of Asian Americans and also to talk about, I guess, the complexities of finding, gathering, and expressing this, I guess, the stories behind data about the Asian American community, which is something that I think a lot of big projects like the Pew Research Poll have had a hard time capturing. So really quickly, by way of introductions, Ben Blatt is with us, who is a staff writer at Slate.com, and he's been doing a lot of really neat stuff lately with different data sets and maps in order to, I guess, tell different stories at Slate. And I think his methods are really neat. We also have Minnis, who works at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and she is the director of Census and voting programs. So she's also an expert on census policy and Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act. So she can talk a little bit about the way in which Section 203, which is specifically about language access, is impacted by things like the U.S. Census. Dr. Karthick Ramakrishnan, who's a professor of political science and public policy at University of California, Riverside. He's a co-director of the National Asian American Survey, runs AAPIdata.com, and is also a co-founder of AAPIVoices.com. And finally, Dr. Eric Vikstrom is with us on the phone. He's a sociologist in the education and social stratification section of the U.S. Census Bureau. And he specifically works with the American Community Survey data, and he's specifically interested in a lot of this language data that we're looking at. And we wanted to have this hangout partially because there are a lot of questions around the set of maps that were produced by Ben over at Slate and then Karthick at AAPIVoices, and talk a little bit more about where that data comes from, why it's important, and I guess do a little interpretive work there as well. So thanks for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to Ben. We're going to give everybody a chance to sort of introduce themselves and their work, and talk a little bit about, I guess, these bigger topics. Then we'll do a Q&A. You can ask us questions via Twitter using the hashtag AAPIVoices, or if you're watching via Google+, you can just ask using the Google+ Q&A app. So, Ben, you want to talk a little bit about your work at Slate and the maps you built?
Sure. So I'm Ben Blatt, and I work at Slate. I do things all related to data, sometimes more serious, sometimes less serious. And the post I'm going to be talking about today, which you may have seen or may not have seen, kind of have to do with mapping data, specifically language data, to different states. I've been doing a series of posts. I've kind of coined the term, I think it was out there, a viral map, and these are very simple maps where pretty much all the data is stripped away, except for maybe the most popular attribute of a certain state. And I've been doing a series of these, and I did one for language in the United States, and those ones really seem to resonate with a lot of people in different ways. So I'm actually going to try to share my screen, so if you haven't seen these maps, you can get a sense of what I'm talking about. Can everyone see these maps I have posted right now? So essentially, I decided to go through ACS data, which is an offshoot of the census. It's part of the Census Bureau data, but it's not like the census in that they don't interview everyone in the United States. And as a result, they ask more detailed questions. And one of the questions they ask is, what language do you speak at home? So, you know, if you were to map each state by the most common language, of course, English would just be in every state, so that's not a very interesting thing to map. So I just decided to go through at first and say, other than English, what's the most common language spoken? And still, with this variation, as you can see, I believe maybe 44 states in Spanish. So the variety is not huge, and I kind of wanted to strip that away a bit further. You know, everyone knows English is the most common, obviously, and Spanish is a big number too, but what other languages are people speaking in different states? So the specific data set I used was the 2006 ACS, and that's a bit old, but part of the reasoning, and Eric from the Census may have a better idea whether or not this was a good choice or bad choice, but the ACS has 5-year surveys and 1-year surveys and 3-year surveys, and depending on how big the survey is, the level of detail is different. So, for example, in the 5-year survey, which I was looking at, the languages are really broken up in the survey respondents. So things like French and French Creole are treated differently. Things like German and Pennsylvania Dutch, which some people would consider just Germanic languages, are treated separately. And things such as Mandarin and Cantonese are treated differently. So as you can see in this map I have on my computer now, there's a huge variety state to state. And there's lots of German, there's Vietnamese in Texas and Oklahoma, Tagalog in the west, and French in the northeast. And I think part of the reason, you know, you guys picked up on this was one thing I did not make clear at all in my initial post, and I've since remedied that, but hopefully we can talk more about it, is the way that the ACS categorizes and collects this data is based on what people, I'll go back to my mic right now, but this is all based on what people respond. So when people answer the survey, some people answer Chinese and some do Mandarin or Cantonese. And the way I was categorizing it was I didn't want to group Mandarin and Cantonese together. I didn't want to assume that half the people who answered just Chinese were speaking Mandarin or Cantonese or whatnot. So those were all treated differently. So you may see in the map that New York is labeled Chinese, and that's because more people in New York answered specifically Chinese as opposed to any other language other than English and Spanish. So I think that's probably the map we're going to talk about a lot today, but just to go down the rest of my post, I broke it up in a few other ways. I did a map of Native American languages. Native American languages are not super common in the United States, but Navajo in the Southwest is pretty prevalent. I think there are more Navajo speakers in those 6 states that are highlighted Navajo than there are Native American language speakers of any other language throughout the rest of the United States. So Navajo is really where the majority of Native American language speakers are. I did a map on Scandinavian languages, and that was just including Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian, just to kind of see the variation there. And I also did a map on Indo-Aryan languages, which definitely has some variation state to state, although it is mostly Hindi. And I guess I had forgotten this one, but I also did this as well, the languages that the census groups as African languages. So that's just a quick rundown of the maps I had produced, and you know, these spurred a lot of reaction. I think the maps, you know, these are very simple maps, and I think why they're popular, much more popular than I expected, was because you can look at it and within a second you can see a pattern. You can look at your own state, pick something up on it. You don't see any numbers, so you don't know, is a state, you know, 50% more popular, or this language 50% more popular than our language? Is it, you know, 3 times as much or 1%? You have no sense of that. So you have no sense of the variation within a state or even across states. You know, a state may be labeled with a certain language, but it could be that that language has very few amount of foreign language speakers, while another state has even more, even though there's 1 or 2 languages that are spoken more. And then again, the tricky thing is, what categories are you looking at? You know, if I had gone with bigger generalizations and said all Chinese languages are one family, then more states would have been Chinese. If I had done the same with German or, you know, Indian languages, the same could have resulted in different consequences, and things like that can make these, you know, the same idea for the map, but you could potentially get different results.
Great, thanks a lot. So I'm going to hand it over to Karthik. So if you can talk a little bit about the maps that you produced for AAPIVoices, and also, I guess, what the impetus behind producing those new maps were.
Great. Thanks, Cayden, and thanks to Ben and everyone else for getting on this call. And Cayden, I don't know how to share my screen, so I don't know if you could, if you have the ability to do that when I'm talking. Also, let me know if there's any technical issues. Hopefully, you guys can hear me. Okay. So in terms of yeah, so when I saw Ben's piece, I mean, it's the map. I think went viral for the reasons that Ben talks about, because it simplifies data in a very big way, and it's also we're used to. I think if you think about when maps became so interesting, especially in terms of showing different data and information in a map way, was in the late 90s and the 2000s with the presidential elections. The red and blue maps are something that we're all now very familiar in terms of how we look at and interpret that data. And so that was kind of a seminal moment, and I think that's always part of the appeal there, is it does simplify the information and kind of shows what an image that we're used to seeing, an outline map of the United States and its various states, but with other information that is layered on top of that. So when I looked at that map, the couple of things that just caught me a little bit by surprise. The big thing was to see that Tagalog was the most frequent language as opposed to Chinese in California. And this, I should say, by way of background, I am a professor at the University of California, Riverside. I've been doing a lot of research on Asian Americans and immigrants more generally for over 15 years. I guess pretty soon it'll be close to 20 years. And specifically focusing on Asian Americans since 2008 with the National Asian American Survey, and then more recently with AAPIData.com, which is an effort to democratize data, if you will. Many people who do work on Asian Americans or who do work on specific topics like education, like health, might know about many of these reports and research that gets done, but many people outside of that don't know about it, including many journalists. I found myself getting a lot of journalist calls after 2008 and certainly after our 2012 surveys, asking about various issues related to the Asian American community. So I produced that site in part to make that data and reports very accessible so that journalists can go and get the kind of contextual information on many of these issues. So for instance, if you want to find out more about language needs in the Asian American community, we have a section on our website in AAPIData.com that gives you all of the basically an introduction to the various reports that you need to know to get some context on how language affects the API community. I'll just make one plug, by the way. This is on the issue of language diversity and language needs. We just had a report released yesterday from Center for American Progress and APIData.com. This is a report that it's been in the works for a while. It's part of a report series on Asian Americans. And if you go to APIData.com, you'll see the link to that mini report that looks at language diversity and language needs. So getting to the thing of the slate maps, I saw, so this was, a lot of my friends on Facebook were sharing this. So when I looked at the map, something didn't quite sit right with me. Part of it was looking at the data on California. I wasn't surprised looking at the Midwest and parts of the Mountain West to look at the prevalence of German, because as a researcher on immigration, we know that German immigration was very important to the Midwest in the 1800s, and you had a lot of German language schools that were in place until World War I, actually. So one of the interesting things when you look at the history of language in the United States is that you had many public schools in the United States where the medium of instruction was in German. And it kind of complicates our notion of thinking that the U.S. was always was and always has been an English-speaking country. So I wasn't surprised to see the incidence of German in many of these states. Although, to be accurate, many of these states the populations are much smaller, and the language-speaking populations are even much smaller than you'd find on the seaboards. But anyway, so I thought, let me try to replicate this. So this is one of the things that social scientists try to do is that when they find something, they say, okay, let me see if I can produce the same thing, especially if you think something might be off or different. So at the time when I'd looked at it, Ben hadn't yet posted the reference in terms of where the data source was from. So I kind of went around wildly looking at different kinds of data from the Census website. I looked at the fact finder tables, which is from the American Community Survey, which Eric, I think, can talk about a little bit more. I also downloaded the microdata. So this is the public use microdata sample to see if maybe Ben had used that data set to produce that. And all the different things I found using the most current data, I wasn't able to reproduce that map. So then I thought, what the heck, I'll just produce what I find, and then we can have a conversation to figure out what the source of the issue is. So then I published that, and then Ben wrote to me the following day saying, hey, by the way, I've seen some reactions to this. Just to clarify, this is the data set that I used, and he pointed to the source, which was a 3-year data file from 2006 to 2008. And that data file does have the more detailed language categories that Ben talks about. And I think it's an interesting conversation to be having in terms of how do we measure language. But another part of my post was to also draw attention to the difference between language spoken at home, which I think of generally as language diversity, and language need. One way to maybe put a point to this is, the folks speaking German or French in many of these places, very few of them have any problem speaking English, right? Most of them are speaking language at home by choice, and we just kind of take their word for it in terms of what they say they speak at home. Who knows what percentage of their conversation is in that language? But if you contrast that to many Asian Americans and Latinos, many of those folks that speak an Asian or language at home or Spanish have a lot of difficulty speaking English. And that's where it becomes relevant for policy, because when you're talking about public hospitals that need to provide language assistance, voting, which Terry will talk about, where you have regulations in terms of what kind of assistance needs to be provided, it's very different when you look at English proficiency versus just language use at home. So that was another major point that I wanted to make. So we have 4 maps that we featured on our site, and 2 of them look at language need in particular, not just language use at home or language diversity more generally. And I can talk more in the Q&A later about some of those findings.
Great, thanks a lot, Karthik. So this is probably a good time to get Eric to weigh in a bit, especially about the American Community Survey and what kind of data the Census does collect on language and his work with the Census Bureau. Eric is on my laptop, so if things are a little hard to read or hard to hear for folks, please let me know and I'll try and adjust things accordingly. So Eric.
Hi everybody, this is Eric. I hope everyone can hear me okay. And Cayden, do please let me know if there are any technical issues if you all are having trouble hearing, and we'll try to regroup. But I just wanted to thank you all for involving me in this conversation. It's really exciting to see the interest that has been generated with the use of these data from the Census Bureau. And so we're happy to have an opportunity to chat about it. I just want to talk a little bit more in depth about the American Community Survey and the language data that come from it, just to give a little bit more methodological context to the discussion. So the American Community Survey, as some people have already mentioned, is a household survey conducted every year by the Census Bureau. In 2012, it collected data from about 2.4 million households, which is about 2% of all the households in the United States. The survey has a really high response rate and is really the only source for this kind of language data. So it's a really great resource. And beyond just the language data, the survey is used by many federal agencies to allocate almost $400 billion of federal funding to state and local agencies. So it's a really important source of data on a lot of topics, including language. So in terms of the language data in particular, as I think Ben mentioned, the question that we ask on the American Community Survey is whether or not a person speaks a language other than English at home. If the respondent indicates that they do speak a language other than English, we ask them to write in the language that they speak at home. And then we also ask for a self-assessment of English ability. Those are kind of the three main questions that we use to produce the language data. And those questions have been on the American Community Survey since the beginning. So a little bit more in terms of the design of the ACS and the difference between single-year and multi-year estimates that have already been brought up. Basically, we produce period estimates that range in length from 1 year to 3 years to 5 years. And basically, these different period estimates correspond to different geographical levels within the U.S. So, for example, the 1 year data can provide estimates for any place in the U.S. that has over 65,000 people living in it, including all states, all congressional districts, and any other place with a population of over 65,000. The 3 year data pools data for areas over 3 years of the survey and can provide estimates for all places with a population of over 20,000 people. And the 5 year data pools data over 5 years of the survey and can provide estimates for all areas in the U.S. And the reason we do this is because for geographic areas where the populations may be small, the multi-year estimates allow us to pool the samples for these areas over multiple years so that we can actually produce estimates for these areas with small populations. So in terms of using the data, when you're trying to decide between 1 year, 3 year, or 5 year estimates, it's important to keep in mind the balance that these different period estimates offer between timeliness on the one hand and precision and reliability on the other hand. So, for example, the 1 year estimates will be more current, but will apply only to larger areas of geography and will, in theory, for some measures be less precise, while the multi-year estimates will be more precise because of a larger sample size, but will also be less current because they combine more years of data. And in terms of languages as well, I think data users should keep in mind the fact that many large-scale surveys, such as the American Community Survey, often have a hard time capturing rare populations or rare events. So if there are, for example, few speakers of a given language in a certain geographical area, then there is a chance that a survey based on a sample will not capture those people that are speakers of that particular language. So I think that's something to keep in mind. Just one other thing to say about differences in the different data products that have been mentioned. I think Karthick mentioned the fact finder tables and the PUMs and all of these. So just to give an overview of these products, we do have a website called American Fact Finder, which is our main data product dissemination portal. And on this website, you can find standard tabulations of the American Community Survey data that we produce every year, and that are based on the full ACS single or multi-year micro data. And in terms of language, we produce a variety of tables, including, for example, a table with the ID B16001, which is language spoken at home by ability to speak English for the population 5 years or older. So that table has the most detail on individual languages that is available on the standard tables on American Fact Finder. And that table has 39 languages or language groups. And if you use the 5 year data, in theory, this table is available at very small levels of geography. The trade-off, of course, is that we only have 39 languages or language categories available in that table. So if you're interested in more detail on individual languages, as Karthick mentioned, we have the PUMs, or the Public Use Microdata Sample. And this is a sample of the ACS microdata that the Census Bureau makes available to data users, and you can download it and analyze it in your own statistical software. Or we have a tool on the website called Data Ferret, where you can produce some tabulations online. And so the PUMS files, for example, include much more detail on individual languages than the fact finder table. So for example, in the 2012 one-year PUMS file, we had 110 languages or language groups listed compared to the 39 that you see on the American Fact Finder table. The trade-off here is that the PUMS files still don't list all of the languages for which we have data because of disclosure avoidance rules. And in addition, the PUMS are only available down to the level of the PUMA, or public use microdata area, which are areas of states with 100,000 or more residents. And finally, we do have custom tabulations of ACS data available, which are done upon request from data users and for a fee. And these are customizable in terms of the variables that are used and also the geographic level. In addition, there are two publicly available special tabulations that we've already produced and made available on our language use website, one using decennial census data from 2000, and the other using 3-year American Community Survey data from 2006 to 2008, which I believe was the basis for the slate maps. So that's a quick overview of the language data in the American Community Survey. I'm happy to take more questions about any of that during the Q&A.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Eric. Terry, maybe this is like a good segue into talking about, Eric mentioned that millions of policy dollars are sort of decided by a lot of the findings of the census. And I know that your specialty is specifically around, I guess, Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act, which is about language access. But if you could talk a little bit about your work with AAJC and the importance of understanding these language access needs, that would be awesome. Also, I think you're muted, so be sure to unmute yourself.
Great. Thanks, Cayden. I'm Terry Minnis, Director of Census and Voting Programs at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. We are a national, nonprofit, nonpartisan organization focused on advancing and protecting the civil and human rights of Asian Americans and to building a fair and equitable society for all. And I think, you all have hit upon a really important piece, is that as much fun as it is to look at the data maps, and I am a self-professed data geek, so I do enjoy looking at the maps, there are real consequences on the policy side and kind of planning side and infrastructure side and whatnot to having access to quality data around language use and, as Karthick mentioned, language need in particular. So I think that to kind of put it in context, I did want to just note that when looking at the Asian American community, this is a community that has high proportion, not surprisingly, of folks who speak a language other than English at home. Right, I believe more than 3/4 of our community have noted that they speak a language other than English at home, and about 1 in 3 Asian Americans say that they have some difficulty with the English language. And of course, this has serious repercussions with respect to policy decisions, as well as really the implementation of policy, not just how you decide what policy gets put in place, but really how does it get executed. So I think Section 203 is a really great example of the interplay of all these pieces. Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act is a provision that requires certain jurisdictions that meet a numeric threshold to provide language assistance in the election process. And this means a written language, so a written assistance such as translated ballots. It means oral assistance such as having bilingual poll workers at the polling stations, polling sites, and it also means that the jurisdiction has a responsibility to publicize the availability of this language assistance. All that being said, I think one thing that's interesting is that the statutory language of Section 203 actually explicitly implicates the American Community Survey data as the source that's meant to be used to make these determinations. The determinations are made by the Census Bureau, the director of the Census Bureau, and they are not challengeable. And what the Census Bureau looks at is looks at trying to see whether or not a jurisdiction fulfills a formula, which is either 5% of a jurisdiction, 10,000 people in a jurisdiction, or 5% of an Indian reservation that are citizens of voting age, that are of a single language minority, and that are limited English proficient, which is defined by the Census Bureau as anybody who says that they speak English less than very well. And then once that determination has been made, you look at the overall group, so let's say it's Chinese, and see whether or not their literacy rate is higher than that of the national average. So once that's all figured out, then the Census Bureau releases a list, what are called the Section 203 determinations, of which jurisdictions are captured. The other thing the Census Bureau does, which is really, really great and helpful, is that in order to make these determinations, they have to run a special tabulation, and they actually make that special tabulation available publicly for people to look at. And one way that this has been used for groups on the ground that has been very useful is to be able to look at jurisdictions that just missed the cutoff, right? So for the Asian American community, in part because of where we are located in a lot of urban centers, it's a little bit harder to meet that 5% threshold. So we more or less rely on the 10,000 threshold to get coverage for Section 203. And so looking at this, at the special tabulation, you can determine whether or not you just missed it. Maybe you're at 9,000, maybe you're at 9,500, and that kind of girds you with the ability to go into your local election officials to talk to them about possibly providing some voluntary coverage for these languages that will probably be captured within the next determination, and these determinations are made every 5 years. And that was one thing, actually, that when we reauthorized the Voting Rights Act in 2006, we took advantage of the fact that the American Community Survey was an annual survey compared to the previous long form from the decennial, and allowed us the flexibility to make these determinations more often than once a decade. In addition to that, census data is also very helpful within the Section 203 context for jurisdictions in helping them determine which polling locations to target for bilingual poll workers, recognizing that there may be some poll sites that have no need, and there are some poll sites that may have extensive need that might need, for example, more than one poll worker. This is the type of data that will really allow the jurisdictions to kind of make those types of determinations. It also allows them to make determinations around which dialect to provide assistance. As Ben had mentioned, there's a variety of responses even to the ACS question itself. Is it Cantonese? Is it Mandarin? And so forth. And having access to this data can help, in addition to talking and working with the local groups, can help jurisdictions determine which are the appropriate dialects for the languages that are covered to provide at the polling locations. Finally, in the Section 203 context, I think the census data has also been very helpful for local community-based organizations who are looking to run poll monitoring projects where they go out and look to see how well the jurisdictions are doing in their Section 203 obligations. In 2012, Asian Americans Advancing Justice and its other AAJC and its other affiliates worked with local groups on a project, and we were able to figure out which were the polling sites we should send our volunteers to, in part not only working with the local jurisdiction but also looking at census data to see if there were places where need wasn't being met or where the assistance just wasn't being provided properly. So I think within that context, those are all the different ways that the language data is really, really helpful in the voting context. Switching quickly to the healthcare context, we've all seen a lot of the coverage around the first wave of the open enrollment for the Affordable Care Act, and one of the things that we have certainly at Advancing Justice-AAJC been looking and monitoring is to see how well they've been able to provide language access and language assistance to the marketplace for the folks who are trying to sign up. Not only are there just federal civil rights requirements as a federally funded program, there were also specific provisions within the bill itself and the act itself that had requirements with respect to making sure that LEP folks were able to actually access the health care that they needed and deserved. So I think one of the things that has been interesting in looking at all of the the reports out from this first phase of the open enrollment is that of the data that has been provided, there has been no data that's actually provided on those who've signed up with respect to their languages. And in fact, we haven't even seen data on data disaggregation on the Asian American communities and groups, which is another issue, which we can discuss at another time because it's a whole issue into itself. But just wanted to flag that, within the healthcare context, we know we have the anecdotal stories. We know, whether it's anecdotal stories just from people we know or from our partners on the ground, we know that language access is an issue. But we don't have the data to back it up, and we don't have the data that allows us to really proactively plan a strategy to reach those that need to be reached. We all have limited resources. We need to be smart about it, and it's data, language data or any other type of data that really makes us able to use our resources smartly and really get to those who need the help the most.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Terry. So we've got some questions coming in from the audience, which is great. If anybody out there watching does want to ask our panel a question, you can use the Google Plus Q&A app or use the hashtag AAPIVoices on Twitter. I think data disaggregation is kind of it's like a hot topic, I think, for the Asian American community right now, because one of the things that has been lifted up around that is that different ethnic groups within the Asian American and Pacific Island designation, which is a huge designation, have a lot of very different socioeconomic experiences and stuff like that in the United States. One of the questions that we got is specifically about considerations about aggregating and disaggregating data. One of our viewers points out that the grouping of Cantonese and Mandarin is sort of interesting, and I know that on AAPIVoices.com, a lot of people were raising questions about the frequency of Tagalog also in, I guess, Ben's original California map, and then also in Hawaii, where Tagalog is not the only language from the Philippine Islands that's spoken in Hawaii. So I guess that question is primarily for Ben and Karthik, but Eric, maybe you have something to say on it as well.
Yeah, so I'll say something. I mean, so one of the things about the question about when is it appropriate to aggregate. I mean, part of the answer is look at the federal mandates, right? So if you look at something like Mandarin and Cantonese, there is measurement error in the sense that some people might have thought about saying Mandarin versus Cantonese or other Chinese languages or dialects, whereas other people might have just thought to say Chinese. And so it really brings up this difficult question because you can't know what's in people's heads, right? To know whether if they meant to aggregate in their own minds or not. And so the federal standard when it comes to providing language assistance is to aggregate the Chinese languages as under Chinese for purposes of either Section 203 assistance or even any local regulations. You might have certain counties that mandate certain assistance for their public hospitals, and so they rely on the higher grouping of data. So I think that part of it is to understand the policy context, and some of these are just laws that say this is the way, or even regulations or practices by government agencies that say that you will aggregate in these circumstances, but not others. I've also had different conversations with, in the survey research that we do, we have provided language assistance both in Mandarin and Cantonese, but what's interesting is that the script that we use is a simplified Chinese, right? And so part of the thing about Mandarin and Cantonese is most of the written text that you see is using a simplified Chinese, especially text that you see that is web-based these days. And I'm not entirely clear. Yeah, I hear conflicting reports about how much Mandarin and Cantonese speakers can understand each other. The consensus that anything approaching a consensus I've heard is that they can. It's a little difficult, but they can do it. But I think it is context specific when you're talking about language disaggregation. For South Asian languages, and this is where I know this because I can't say that I speak a South Asian language. I butcher a South Asian language, maybe more accurate. But I understand a good chunk of Tamil, which is one of the South Asian languages. And these languages, they have different scripts from each other. They also have very different ancient histories in terms of how they developed. And so for a lot of the South Asian languages, especially the difference between North India and South India, the folks would not understand each other at all if they were speaking to each other. So I think knowing that kind of deeper understanding is important. But it is interesting, and for Filipino languages, I think there's more of a movement now among folks to not just say that they speak Tagalog, but to talk more specifically about Ilocano or other Filipino languages that they speak. And that's also where I found, if you look at the PUMS data, this is the publicly used microdata sample, you get different results in terms of how prevalent Ilocano and Tagalog are in a state like Hawaii based on what you choose. So it is, I mean, what's interesting is that language is so incredibly important, and the Census Bureau is kind of the premier place to look for language data. But even there are limitations in terms of how deep you can go into the data to answer some of these questions.
Great. Ben or Eric, do you guys want to weigh in on this question of disaggregation?
I do
just have a couple of things to say in terms of this issue. I think Ben mentioned before that, and I mentioned when I was talking before, that the way that we collect the data is to ask people what language they speak at home, and they write in a language, you know, either by hand if they're replying by mail, or they type it in the internet questionnaire. But they supply the name of the language, and then we receive that write-in, and we assign it a code, a numeric code, and we actually have 382 different codes that we have. So we do code several hundred languages. So, but as Karthick mentioned, there are limits, and we are constrained by what people write in. So if people write in Chinese, and many people do write in Chinese, the only code we can assign to that write-in is our code for Chinese, and we would like to have a more detailed code than that, but we're limited by what the write-in says. And you know, we put a lot of effort into making sure that it's as accurate as possible, but we can't do more than what the data are giving us.
Right on. Ben?
You know, I was just curious, almost from the census perspective, because I would imagine, you know, with these difficulties, they could be changed in the future. There could be other ways of asking the question or specifying that the census would want Mandarin or Cantonese or greater level. I assume there's probably ways to estimate what percentage of Chinese speakers are speaking a specific language, but it does seem like to be almost a pretty big not an oversight, but a very tricky thing. I remember looking at the data. I think it was in New York. There were roughly the same amount of speakers of people who wrote Chinese, Cantonese, and Mandarin. So you know, you have these three, or maybe two different languages, or three different whatever. You know, there are other Chinese languages that people could have been asking, but there's, you know, hundreds of thousands of people whose, you know, voices either not being counted or counted maybe wrong, or just makes it very, very difficult. And it seems like a very, very tricky situation with the way the data is categorized now.
Right on. Another big, it looks like another big bucket of questions that people have are also about tools. So some folks are asking what tools are used to make maps, and then also there's also a couple of questions here about like the Census's tools in terms of data ferret, making that data more accessible to researchers and also folks who want to mess around with data at home. So I would be interested in hearing from both Ben and Karthick how y'all make maps. I'm an erstwhile map maker myself, but
yeah. So I'll say a little bit about what I did specifically in this case. I mean, there are all these like power tools you can use. There are these GIS tools, both you know, both paid and kind of open source GIS tools that people could use. But those don't look they don't look good, right? I mean, they're the GIS tools. They're accurate, but they don't look like the maps that you see on Slate or the ones that I was able to produce. I used a vector file, from Wikimedia Commons, right? So from Wikipedia, got the SVG file, which is a vector graphic, and then pulled it into Adobe Illustrator, and was able to choose the specific shapes of states to be able to do that. Now that outline file had a black outline between the states. I just changed it to white and just went with that. So I think that strategy works if you're doing states. If you then want to get down to the county level, you really have no option other than going with a more hardcore solution like GIS. But there might be more kind of visually pleasing county shape files that are out there.
Actually, a good way to do that is I make a lot of maps using Google Fusion tables, and Google Fusion tables gives you access to county data, voting district data, and stuff like that. And basically, you just use spreadsheets in Google Docs and merge spreadsheets together to make actually fairly aesthetically pleasing maps. And there's a lot of information you can get there. So if people are interested in that, that's like, I'm a big Google Fusion tables fan. Ben, could you talk a little bit about how you make maps?
I probably, if I were to make a map, I would the process that Karthick uses is almost very, very similar to what I usually do. Since I was producing, a ton of maps for this language project, and although, other, simple maps, I use D3, which is a open source library with JavaScript. And, you need to know JavaScript and some data visualization, but once you do that, the advantage was once I made one kind of mapper program that you could put in the variables and it would color it for you, I could keep doing that and it would do it automatically and pick the colors. I got an email from one of my old visualization and cartography professors who he liked the maps, but he thought that the colors were almost like too bright and did not, denote they were not like the cartographer choice. But I actually think the colors I ended up choosing for like an online medium in order to share and easily digest it because they're very bright, flamboyant colors. Probably actually helped its popularity. Just kind of it was so simple and right at you.
Right on. Actually, maybe this is also I got sort of curious now that we're talking about this. Terry, how does AAJC, I guess, keep track of the areas where y'all work and how you prioritize things?
So I think if you're talking with respect to the Section 203 work, right, the determinations are made by the Census Bureau, so we have that to work with. But I think on any issue that we look at, we're really looking to see where we have partners on the ground is one piece of it. But another piece is looking at the data to see what our community is there, what needs might be. So I'll give you an example. There's a lot of activity that's been going around with voter suppression laws, and some of these states that may be, passing some of these more restrictive laws, may be states that don't have a lot of Asian Americans in it. And so for us, even though it's an important issue, because we do have limited resources, we could then look at the data and say, hey, maybe if Iowa, for example, is trying to do something, and our population isn't really that big there and we don't really have a strong partner there, then that would not be a place that we would prioritize, for example. And there might be other places where I think Karthick really kind of hit the nail on the head in the sense that there may be places where there isn't necessarily a huge population, but there may be a very discrete area where there's a population with a very serious need. And so I think that the data really helps us to be able to get at that. And I think for those types of activities, you really need to be able to access, the data, whether it's data directly from the Census Bureau using FactFinder. I have not mastered data fair yet. Hopefully one day I will. But I think that it's great to have so much data, but at the same time, it does sometimes get a little overwhelming, and it can get difficult to know, which set should I be looking at, which is the most current, which is the one, that would have probably the smallest margin of error, and so forth. But I will say, I just wanted to say too, with respect to the maps, I think one thing that's great about this, and the fact that there's more accessibility, whether it's through open source programming and stuff like that, is that I think that particularly with respect to advocacy, these types of maps and these types of graphics can become something that people do grasp right away. And so whereas it may have taken, like 5 sentences to explain something before, now you have these maps that are able to just, kind of really tell the story in one glance.
So there's one thing I wanted to say with respect to that. That's absolutely right. But it's also important to not get too sucked into the mapping. And the thing I wanted to, and Ben noted these caveats too with the subsequent map that he made looking at legal permanent residence, is that sometimes you actually want to just see the numbers, and sometimes not necessarily geographically constrained by states. Because I'll just mention this report that we just released yesterday. If you look at a map, first of all, if you looked at a map in terms of what's the most language spoken other than English, you'd see Spanish throughout the U.S. And so someone might come out with a mistaken impression that everyone in the U.S. who doesn't speak English speaks Spanish. But that would be a mistaken assumption to make. And even if you look at language need in the report that we put out, we find that Asian Americans are actually the ones, if you look at the Asian alone population, they're the ones most likely to speak a language other than English at home, more so than Latinos even. And they're about as even with Latinos when you look at people who have limited English proficiency. So the question of who has the most language needs in this country, most people don't think that it's Asian Americans. And that's also part of the surprise that I had when looking at that map, is if you look at that map, you might come up with the mistaken assumption that there are no Asian language needs in this country, but that is an issue with the it's a wrong interpretation of the map to be relying on something like that. I think that you guys might need to unmute yourself because it looks like Cayden has his internet connection has dropped. So maybe I'll take over moderation. Can you guys just unmute yourself? Okay.
First.
Yeah. So. So in terms of, so we have 5 minutes left, and let me just look at the other comments that people had. So Eric isn't on because he was connected to Cayden. So there was a question about, are there any plans to update DataFerret? And I'm very sympathetic to this because if you look at, Ben, I don't know if you've looked at DataFerret, but it's like the user interface it looks like it's something from the 90s. It's very clunky, and it relies on Java, and you can see why only power users end up using DataFerret, because it's. I love DataFerret, but there are times that I wish that DataFerret were nicer to me. But that is something that I think is a barrier that. There's a lot of democratization of data, but I think that having some of these tools that are still a little bit clunky make it more challenging for people to access that. But I guess the other thing to round it out then, I guess I'll start with Ben and then Terry and then I'll close it out, is Ben, so from this, do you do things outside of mapping for Slate, or is maps kind of going to be your big thing?
Maps was not a complete detour, but a bit of a detour into my usual type of work. I did a thing this week on common letters that trip people up in the spelling bee, which is kind of more my statistics background. With the maps, I think I was obviously I kind of seen this phenomenon. These very simple maps do very well, and that's kind of why I wanted to explore that. But I was still shocked at how how well these did, because they're for the most part one of the simpler mathematical statistical things to do. But since I think they're so simple, they resonate so much. And I think, the maps I was producing were mostly just meant for the purpose of, here's the data, instead of going through the data table, here's, a very quick hit of what the data looks like mapped. Just kind of in a very easy to understand, colorful way. But I think, given now how popular they were and how they spread, much quicker than I had anticipated, I really think that it is a very interesting way to illustrate data. I think the maps did not have a purpose, but if you were advocating for a group or illustrating a point, I think these maps could have a lot of power. And not just this one type of map, but I think kind of just this very quick illustration, as maybe Terry Karthick said, you could explain with a paragraph, and sometimes you do need to do that to tell the whole story. But if you want to reach a broad audience, kind of this data science is now a way to do that both just media-wise and maybe politically or advocacy or whatever.
Great. Terry, any concluding thoughts about language, not just in the voting context, but maybe in other contexts too, and how that might be particularly relevant for Asian Americans?
Sure. I mean, I think, as I mentioned before, if you look at the data around language use and language needs for Asian Americans, it's just such a big issue. And I mean, even looking just at the census itself, we have these conversations with the Census Bureau about whether or not language outreach and assistance that they provide for their surveys, whether or not that's adequate to really reach our communities to make sure that we're getting, the accurate picture of what our community's needs really are. So I'll give you an example. For the 2010 census, the Census Bureau certainly had a pretty robust language assistance program. They translated their questionnaire into 5 other languages and provided language assistance guides translated in 59 languages on top of that 5. But for the American Community Survey, they don't have a similar program to that extent. And so there is a question, right, that we have to ask ourselves about the American Community Survey data that you all are using in your maps is it still kind of missing a big portion of our community? Is there an undercount that's specific to the LEP portion of our communities who looked at this 50 plus questionnaire and said, yeah, all in English, and said, I think I'm just not going to fill this out. So I think, even within just the census context, and I think you can play that out in every issue area for Asian Americans, and particularly as it relates to being able to access services or resources that are being provided, whether by the federal government, state governments, local governments, and whatnot. I think it just really has an impact, that's really far-reaching within our community.
So one other question that I see here that's been asked, and maybe I'll just answer that, and then Cayden, you can close us out, is how can community leaders and student leaders on campuses, et cetera, utilize census data to advance our goals and projects? So I'll just use this as a plug to talk about one particular project that we're doing at API Data. This is a collaboration with Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Los Angeles. We have a thing called Quick Stats. So if you go to our API Data website /stats, or just go through our website, you'll find it. We try to simplify the data that's available through FactFinder. So even FactFinder, we find that a lot of people feel intimidated trying to access information. They have to make hand calculations or import the data into Excel and then rework it in some way. So some of the frequently requested tables, we have it at the state level, at the county level, and the congressional district level, so that people can just grab the information. They can download it as an Excel file. They can print it out as a PDF. Just have that information about how many numbers of this group are there in this county, right? Or what does the educational attainment of Asian Americans look like in this state? So we are able to provide that information, and we're going to expand on that. So tweet at me at Karthick R or at API Data, and we want to add more and more tools. And the final thing I want to say is that so we are doing more and more infographics and maps, but please rely that as the kind of the entree, right? So I think it's great that it inspires a lot of people to share. People like pictures. We get that because people don't have time to read more, and visual data I think is very appealing. But please use that opportunity to link through and read the context and the reports that try to make sense of that, because that is only part of the story.
Right on. Well, we're at just a minute after 1 p.m. Pacific here. I want to thank everybody who tuned in for joining us today. And I lost Eric at the Census Bureau, but he sends his regards. And thank all of our panelists for joining us today. It was a really great discussion. I feel like one of the questions that I guess I want to sort of like.
So I think, Cayden, I think it's very. This might be good to just end it, because I don't know if you guys are hearing that very.
Am I breaking up?
Yeah, in a very major way.
All right. Very well then. Great. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. The
Okay.
video will be archived on and also at AAPIVoices.com.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Great talking with everyone.
Thank you. Bye.